There it is, in verse 2. There it is. And now, so when this is talking about the office, this is talking about the role. So you see why he's using these words interchangeably? They can be translated the same. He's talking about in the sense of this is what they do, this is who you are. And then, of course, the next term that he brings up as well is that idea of poimen. Poimen. And you can hit it again with the shepherd. And you saw that there in verse 2. Shepherd the flock of God is among you. Exercise oversight. Be examples to the flock. And such. Now let me just talk about one more element here. So if you go to the next slide, there's just two little thoughts we want to come up with. Because when Titus is, when Paul is writing to Titus, I'll get it right. When Paul is writing to Titus, he's telling them of a need that they have. Things are out of order and they need to be in order. And this is so important that we understand this. In the King James Version, the New American Standard Bible, it talks about setting things in order. And what was needed? It was oversight. Oversight was needed. Now, I've heard of a ministry, in fact, I was told firsthand of a ministry that lacked so much oversight that some of the staff members were getting frustrated. In fact, 2 walked out of their job. Necessary elements of this ministry. And it's because of the lack of oversight. It becomes frustrating. And that's why Paul says things are out of order when this happens. By the way, let me give this to you, and I don't know if I wrote it down in the verses or not. Is there anything there from 1 Corinthians? I don't think so. Okay, mark these down. You will want to see these because these are vital. In 1 Corinthians chapter 14, Paul is writing specifically about using spiritual gifts in the church. And sometimes if there's nobody there to give oversight, that confusion comes out. And so this is what he says. In verse 33, he says, God is not a God of confusion, but of peace. That's 1 Corinthians 14:33. And then he ends that whole chapter, chapter 14, in verse 40, and he says this, but all things should be done decently and in order. That is a dynamic passage, particularly in the context of what it's talking about. Because there's so much confusion that can come within when people don't understand things. And that's one of the reasons why we talk about things in the Bible when we're here. When we come together on Sunday, one of the reasons why I'm even talking about this stuff. You know, why don't we get off this and get on into Titus? Well, we will tomorrow, next time. But this is vital that we understand that God has set an order. Why? Because He's an orderly God. And He wants an orderly church. He wants orderly people. Doesn't want robots. That's not what He's talking about. He just wants things to be in order. Because you know what? I don't know about you, but I have seen things when they are out of order. And the testimony, folks, frankly, is lost. And people look at that and they say, you know, I get that at work. Why should I join the family of God? Why should I give my life to Jesus? I see that happen, you know, in my family. God gives these for a reason, because there's the need. The need. So, God wanted to set things in order. Who needed, what was needed? Oversight. Who was called? Elders to superintend. The next element is the nature. The nature. Also there in verse 5. Because he says to appoint elders. What was done? Leadership. How? Through shepherds. Through feeding. You know, he also wrote to Timothy, chapter 4, verse 14 of the first book of Timothy. He says, do not neglect the gift that's in you, which was given to you by the prophecy when the council of elders, the overseers, laid their hands on you. They were recognized by God, and they gave what? Their word of approval. That's what ordination is all about. It's just a recognition of approval. So they gave that approval. By the way, when I was going through my ordination council, I had, I think, 25 or 30 men that we had invited, and the little Whitworth Baptist Church could probably only hold about 30 people. So here I had all these guys that had been to Bible school and seminary, and some of them have been pastors for 30, 40, 50 years, you know. There was a pulpit up there that I was standing behind while they were shooting questions at me. They came in, I think, about 6:30. By 10 o'clock, we were still going at it. If anybody wants any counsel on what to do and what not to do at an ordination council meeting, you know, 30 men, no. You talk about some of them showboating. Anyhow, I had this velvet stuff over the pulpit, you know, and some were saying I was making tracks. You know, my hands look like this, making tracks in the velvet. But you know, it's really good, because one of the questions that one of the men asked was, they asked if I had any kind of reputation in the community. What would people think about Mike Tremblay if you were to go to some of the people in the community ask? And they asked this of the leadership of the church that was getting ready to ordain me. And I thank God that they gave a positive answer. You know, so all that money I paid them under the table worked. No. So anyhow, it was interesting thing. This by the way, this was way back in 1984. So anyhow, the council was there, and then of course they gave the approval, and then they had this service where they laid hands on me. And basically what I was saying is it was a recognition of approval. See, that's what it's about. And so that's what he mentions here in 4:14 of 1 Timothy. He says, don't neglect the gift that's in you. And it was recognized by laying on the hands of the elder. Chapter 5, also of 1 Timothy, verse 17 says, let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor, especially those that labor in preaching and teaching. But all things should be done decently and in order. Isn't that good? And then finally, we read in the passage I referred to a little bit ago, chapter 3 of 1 Timothy, 1 and 2, this is a trustworthy saying, if anyone aspires the office of overseer, he desires a noble task, therefore an overseer must be above reproach. So that's the nature, the element, leadership, shepherd, feeding. What we're saying is simply this: the called out body of Jesus Christ has a called out leadership that God has called, God's choice to lead and feed His family. Okay? Now let me make one more comment before we wrap up. And that is on the next slide. And that is the idea of headship. Headship. Because what I want you to know is that elders are not the head of the church. Do we get that? Elders are not the head of the church. Check out these verses. Now I know this is written down in Ephesians, isn't it, Bob?
Yes.
Ephesians chapter 4. Is that there?
Ephesians 1:22 is there.
Okay, well, we'll refer to that. Well, okay, let me read that one then for you real quick. Ephesians 1:22, and then I'll just read a few other verses from Ephesians and Colossians. It says, and I have this in the Contemporary English Version, it says, God has put all things under the power of Christ, and for the good of the church He has made Him the head of everything. This is Jesus Christ. He's the head. You follow that? He's the head. Ephesians 4:15 says, speaking the truth in love, that we may grow up in all things in Him, which is the head, even Christ. Chapter 5, verse 23, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is head of the church, and He is the Savior of the body. Colossians 1:18, and he is head of the body, the church, that all things he might have the preeminence. Colossians 2:10, King James Version, and you are complete in him, which is the head of all principality and power. And then again, the contemporary English version of chapter 2, Colossians and verse 19, Christ who is the head of the whole body. So what we have here is that body leadership is leading by following the head themselves. How do you know you have a good leader? He's a good follower of the head, right? He doesn't try to push any of his own things. He just tries to push one thing. Follow the head. Follow the head. Follow the head. So, elders, first of all, Maya, point people to the head. Elders point people to the head. And when we looked at 1 Peter 5, 2 and 3, that's what we saw. Because he said, shepherd the flock of God. Exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you do it. Not for shameful gain, but eagerly, not domineering those that are in your charge, but be an example, he said. That's 1 Peter 5, 2 and 3. Elders point people to the head and people away from themselves. Elders, secondly, practice what they preach. Practice what they preach. They live what they proclaim. Verse 3b says it, be an example to the flock. 1 Peter chapter 5. So let's just talk about the necessity right here. The necessity. First, Titus 1:5b, it says, put elders in every town. Essentially in every body. Every body of Jesus Christ. Every church. Because you see, every church has Jesus Christ as its head, right? And they have elders too. They have elders too. But elders follow the head. So the 2012 challenge, you got to get that right, the 2012 challenge is to follow the leading of the Holy Spirit. As it says in 1 John 2:6, whoever says he abides in him ought to walk in the same way that he walked. Now, there's a preacher in Dallas, Texas named Tony Evans. Anybody hear Tony Evans before? And he's at the Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship Church in Dallas. And he has something to say. And I'd like you to hear it. It's only about 3.5 minutes long. And this is where we're going to end it today. So Maya, if you hit it, you'll see what he has to say.
He says, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. Please notice, Jesus says, this is my ecclesia. But the way you know it's my ecclesia is not because we say that. It isn't even because he says that. He says the way you know this is my ecclesia is hell is not winning. The gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Therefore, if hell is winning, we're not building his church. We're building our church using his name. Much of what goes under the caption today of church is not church. It is a loose gathering of independent stones who happen to show up at the same location on a weekly basis, who have no legislative authority. But they fellowship. They're inspired for an hour and 15 minutes if you're white, 2 hours if you're black. They're encouraged. They're stimulated. But there is no authority. It says, I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. To understand the church, to the kingdom is to understand that its job in history is to legislate in the spiritual realm. Now, there's a whole lot of theology that I don't have time to get into today. I could probably talk on these two verses for 20 hours nonstop, because that's how much theology intersects with it. But let me explain how important church is. You see, the problem today that we are facing is not a problem of the culture. The culture is being consistent because it is run by the God of this age. So all that we complain about is consistent with the kingdom of which it is a part. The problem is not in the secular society. The problem is the church is not the church, so the kingdom of darkness can rule it, because it's not the assembly that Jesus rules over. That's why you can have a racial divide in the church exist for 250 years. That's why you can have illegitimate division. All division is not illegitimate, but you can have illegitimate division because Christ is not ruling the church. The culture is ruling the church. My background is ruling the church. My racial orientation is ruling the church. My political preferences are ruling the church. So Jesus Christ is not the Lord of the church. Therefore, he cannot legislate through the church into the culture. I mean, help me to understand. How can we have all these churches on all these corners with all these preachers and all these members and all these programs and still have all this mess? There's a dead monkey on the line somewhere.